The Pacific Ocean, off the coast of Oregon, 5:30 a.m., September 9, 1942. Darkness absolute and consuming. The only sound is the gentle, rhythmic lap of black water against a steel hull, then a low hiss of compressed air. The sea itself seems to part. As a monstrous form breaches the surface, the long, sleek silhouette of the Imperial Japanese Navy submarine I-25, its forward hangar hatch creaks open, a mechanical yawn in the pre-dawn stillness. Inside, nestled like a fragile insect, is a tiny floatplane. Yokosuka E-14Y Glen. The air is thick with the pungent smell of salt, cold steel, and raw gasoline. Crewmen, mere shadows in the gloom, work with frantic, silent efficiency. They unfold the biplane's wings, its canvas skin taut over a frame that seems impossibly delicate. The pilot, Flight Petty Officer Second Class Nobuo Fujita, squeezes into the cramped cockpit. He checks his instruments by the dim glow of a single lamp. His hands are steady, but his mind is a storm of duty and dread. Behind him, his observer, Petty Officer Shoji Okuda, loads two 168-pound thermite incendiary bombs. Their mission is as audacious as it is desperate: to bomb the American mainland. The submarine turns into the wind. The catapult officer raises his flag. A deep roar shatters the silence as the engine coughs to life. Fujita gives a sharp nod, a violent lurch. The aircraft is hurled into the abyss, its single engine screaming as it claws for altitude, disappearing into the thick coastal fog. The submarine submerges, leaving no trace. The hunt and the flight into legend has begun. This clandestine attack was not an isolated act, but the culmination of a calculated and deeply personal chain of events. To understand the audacity of a single floatplane attacking the continental United States, one must rewind the clock to a clear spring day over Tokyo, April 18, 1942. 16 U.S. Army B-25 Mitchell bombers, led by the audacious Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle, appear as if from nowhere. They roar at treetop level, releasing their payloads on the Japanese capital before vanishing. The physical damage was minor. The psychological shock was seismic. The sacred homeland, the person of the emperor himself, had been violated. The architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, was humiliated. He had promised this would never happen. The military command, stung by this profound loss of face, demanded retaliation. A message needed to be sent back to America: your homeland is not invulnerable. The method for this retaliation had, in fact, been in development for years. Since the 1930s, the Imperial Japanese Navy had pioneered a unique and fearsome weapon: the submarine aircraft carrier. The massive I-400 class boats, capable of carrying 3 bombers, were still on the drawing boards, but the Imperial Navy already possessed a potent, if smaller, tool: the J-3 type I-15 class submarines. Among them was the I-25, a 356-foot behemoth. She was not just a hunter of merchant ships, she was a mobile naval base equipped with a watertight cylindrical hangar built into her conning tower forward of the bridge. Inside this hangar was stored the Yokosuka E-14Y1, an Allied reporting name Glen. It was a 2-seat, single-engine reconnaissance floatplane. Biplane design that seemed an anachronism in an age of monoplane fighters, but its obsolescence was its genius. It was small enough to be stored, light enough to be launched from a compact catapult, and with its wings folded, compact enough to disappear within the submarine's hull. Its mission was primarily eyes for the fleet, but in the furious aftermath of the Doolittle raid, its role was redefined. It would become a bomber. The target selection was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. The planners did not choose a city ringed with anti-aircraft guns and fighter patrols. They chose the vast, dense and vulnerable wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. The objective: to ignite a colossal wildfire in the old-growth timberlands of Oregon. The plan was to use the region's own natural resources as a weapon against it, creating a firestorm so immense it would consume forests, towns, and resources, while screaming a terrifying headline into American newspapers: "Nowhere is safe." The man chosen to execute this plan was a seasoned and respected pilot, 29-year-old Nobuo Fujita, a man of stern discipline. He was a product of the imperial system, yet he possessed a pragmatic, analytical mind that would soon be tested to its absolute limit. He was assigned a skilled observer, Petty Officer Shoji Okuda, and together they began intensive training for a mission that was as dangerous for them as it was for the target. They were to fly hundreds of miles into enemy airspace alone in a slow, unarmed aircraft with the entire American West waiting to swat them from the sky. This ambitious plan, however, was conceived at a time when Japan's strategic momentum was beginning to falter, setting the stage for a mission fraught with peril from the very outset. By late August 1942, the strategic picture for Japan had subtly but decisively shifted. The June victory at Midway, though its full implications were still being digested by the Imperial General Staff, had blunted Japan's offensive spearhead, the Guadalcanal campaign, which began in August, was becoming a voracious consumer of men and ships, a grinding battle of attrition that Japan could ill afford. The mission of the I-25, under the command of Commander Meiji Tagami, was now part of a wider, more desperate strategy to harass and disrupt Allied supply lines along the American and Australian coastlines and to land psychological blows wherever possible. The pressure on Tagami and his crew was immense. They were not just executing orders, they were carrying the weight of a nation's need for retribution. The I-25 departed Japan on a long and perilous voyage across the breadth of the Pacific. Its journey was a testament to the capabilities of these submarine aircraft carriers. It was a hunter stalking Allied shipping lanes, but its primary weapon was hidden in its hangar. On August 15, 1942, the I-25 arrived at the mouth of the Columbia River, the designated launch point for the first bombing attempt. The Glen was assembled on the heaving deck, its fragile form a stark contrast to the rugged submarine. Fujita and Okuda boarded, the engine was started, and the plane was catapulted into the air. But their luck did not hold. A dense, unforecast bank of fog rolled in from the sea, obscuring the coastline entirely. Flying blind and with no hope of locating their target, Fujita was forced to abort the mission. He jettisoned his 2 incendiary bombs harmlessly into the ocean and navigated back to the submarine through the murk, a frustrating and deflating failure. For the next 3 weeks, the I-25 continued its war patrol, sinking 2 merchant ships, and even shelling a military installation at Fort Stevens, Oregon, with its deck gun. Further act of psychological warfare, but the primary mission, the aerial bombing, remained unfulfilled. Commander Tagami, determined to complete his orders, maneuvered the I-25 back into position. The atmosphere aboard the submarine was tense. They had already tempted fate. American patrols were undoubtedly heightened. Every day they lingered off the enemy coast increased the risk of discovery and destruction. For Fujita, the pressure was even more personal. He was a warrior who had failed in his first attempt. The samurai ethos that permeated the imperial military demanded success. As the submarine cruised silently through the cold waters on the night of September 8th, the decision was made. They would try again at first light. The crew worked through the night, preparing the aircraft, checking the bombs and fueling the plane. For Fujita and Okuda, sleep was elusive. They were hours away from becoming the first and only enemy pilots to bomb the contiguous United States, distinction that carried with it the very real probability of a fiery death, either in the skies over America or in the cold waters of the Pacific. The stage was now set. All that remained was the flight itself, a journey that would push a man and his machine to the absolute brink. Nobuo Fujita was a contradiction in the cockpit. He was a dedicated officer of the Imperial Japanese Navy, steeped in the warrior code of Bushido. He carried his katana on his missions, a physical manifestation of his readiness to die for the Emperor. The concept of surrender was alien, dishonorable. A pilot was expected to fight to the last bullet, to the last breath, and if necessary, to use his aircraft as a final weapon. This ethos demanded a complete suppression of the instinct for self-preservation. Yet Fujita was also a highly skilled and experienced aviator. His training had honed not just his courage, but his pragmatism. He understood the mechanics of flight, the limits of his machine, and the cold, hard mathematics of survival. This internal conflict between the unwavering code of the samurai and the analytical mind of the pilot would be the central drama of his mission. As he sat in the cramped cockpit, hurtling towards a foreign shore, he was not just a weapon of the state, he was a man, grappling with the ultimate choice between an honorable death and a potentially shameful survival. The outcome of his flight would hinge on which part of his training, which facet of his character, ultimately won out. The success of the mission relied on one of the most ingenious, yet fragile, weapon systems of the war. The I-25 submarine was a marvel of naval engineering. At over 100 meters long and displacing 2,500 tons, it was a long-range cruiser capable of independent operations for months. Its most remarkable feature was the 30-foot-long, 7-foot diameter watertight hangar, integrated seamlessly into the conning tower fairing. Inside this tube, protected from the corrosive sea, was the Yokosuka E-14Y1 Glenn. Assembling the aircraft was a ballet of precision and danger, conducted on a wet, rolling deck. Crewmen trained for the task would unfold the wings, attach the floats, and conduct pre-flight checks in near-total darkness, often under the threat of enemy patrols. The Glenn itself was a masterpiece of minimalism, with a wingspan of just 11 meters and a top speed of 150 miles per hour. It was slow and vulnerable, but it was also quiet and highly maneuverable. Its wooden and canvas construction made it difficult to detect on radar. It was the Sparrow launched from the belly of the steel whale, a tiny, almost primitive machine, yet it held the power to strike a psychological blow that heavy bombers could not. The bombing of Oregon was not an operation of grand military significance. It was a weapon of perception. Japanese strategists, reeling from the Doolittle raid, understood that warfare was fought on two fronts, the battlefield and the home front. They knew American morale was a critical target. By proving that the continental United States was vulnerable to attack, they hoped to sow panic, force a redeployment of scarce military resources, fighters, anti-aircraft guns, radar units, to defend the long western coastline and shake the American public's confidence in their security. It was a tactic of asymmetry. They could not hope to match American industrial output, so they would attack its sense of invulnerability. The plan to start a catastrophic wildfire was particularly cunning. It threatened to use America's own vast resources as a weapon against itself, creating a spectacle of destruction that would dominate headlines and fuel anxiety. It was a desperate gamble, a pinprick meant to cause a psychological hemorrhage, revealing a command structure that was increasingly seeking symbolic victories to counterbalance grim strategic realities. These perspectives, the pilot's internal struggle, the fragility of his machine, and the calculated desperation of his orders, converged in the pre-dawn darkness off the Oregon coast, setting the scene for an act of unparalleled audacity. For the American public in September 1942, the war was a distant reality, reported newspapers and newsreels. The battles of Coral Sea and Midway were naval victories fought over horizons. The fighting in Guadalcanal was a confused struggle in a steamy, faraway jungle. The continental United States was a vast, secure fortress, its cities and forests protected by two oceans. The blackouts and air raid drills on the west coast were often treated as a mundane, even tedious precaution. The idea of a direct enemy attack was the stuff of Hollywood fantasy. This illusion was about to be shattered when Fujita's bombs fell. They did more than just scorch a patch of forest. They punctured a deeply held national belief. The immediate reaction was one of disbelief, then alarm. Reports of a Japanese plane over Oregon were initially met with skepticism, dismissed as hysterical rumors or misidentified friendly aircraft, but the evidence on the ground was undeniable. The attack triggered a wave of panic along the coastline, civilians reported suspicious lights and phantom aircraft. The military was thrown into a frantic, embarrassed scramble. Fighters were diverted from other duties to patrol the coastline. Anti-aircraft units were placed on high alert. This single, small plane had achieved its primary strategic goal. It forced a nation to look over its shoulder, proving that the war was not just something America sent its boys to fight overseas, but something that could, however faintly, reach back and touch its own soil. From the perspective of the United States Navy, the presence of the I-25 was an Intolerable violation. The submarine and its aircraft were a ghost in the coastal waters. Elusive threat that could strike anywhere along 1,000 miles of shoreline. The primary American vessel tasked with hunting this ghost was the USS Phelps, DD-360. A Porter-class destroyer, commanded by Commander Edward L. Beck. The Phelps was a sleek, powerful warship armed with 8 5-inch guns and a battery of torpedo tubes. It represented the conventional might of the U.S. Navy. Its mission was to find and sink the I-25. This was a duel of cat and mouse, of a powerful hunter and an invisible prey. The Phelps and other patrol vessels scoured the sea lanes, their sonar pinging through the depths, their lookouts scanning the horizons. For the crew of the Phelps, the I-25 was an abstract threat, a blip on a plotter's map. They could not know that their quarry was not just a submarine but an aircraft carrier, and that their paths were destined to cross not in a submerged duel of depth charges, but on the surface, in a moment of desperate, improvised survival. The stage was set for an encounter neither crew could have anticipated. These 5 angles, the pilot's humanity, his fragile technology, Japan's strategic desperation, America's shocked psyche, and the naval hunt, all converged with the roar of a single engine at dawn. The plan was set, the players were in position, the point of no return had been crossed. 5:45 a.m., September 9, 1942, the Yokosuka E-14Y Glenn, piloted by Nobuo Fujita with observer Shoji Okuda, climbs away from the submerged I-25 and turns east, towards the dark, brooding silhouette of the Oregon coastline, the drone of its 340 horsepower. Hitachi Tempo engine is the only sound in the vast, pre-dawn stillness. Fujita's navigation is precise. He follows a bearing that will take him over a specific headland. Landmark identified from pre-war hydrographic charts. His objective lies inland, near Mount Emily, a region of dense, tinder-dry Siskiyou National Forest. The 2 168-pound thermite incendiary bombs are slung beneath his wings. Their design is simple and brutal. Upon impact, a charge would ignite the thermite mixture, burning at over 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to slice through steel and instantly ignite any organic material it touches. As the first hints of sunrise paint the eastern sky, Fujita crosses the shoreline. Below, the world is still asleep. There are no searchlight beams probing the sky, no frantic radio warnings. The American defenses are complacent, utterly unprepared for an attack from this direction. Fujita flies low, following the contours of the wooded terrain, his canvas covered biplane looking more like a civilian craft than a weapon of war. After approximately 50 miles, Okuda confirms their position. They are over their target. The order is given. At 6:18 a.m., from an altitude of just a few thousand feet, the first bomb is released. It tumbles down into the forest canopy, followed shortly by the second. There are no dramatic explosions, only 2 faint, almost insignificant flashes of light, quickly swallowed by the trees. Fujita immediately banks the aircraft, turning hard back towards the Pacific. He does not wait to assess the damage. His mission is one of delivery, not observation. Survival now depends on speed and the cloak of the retreating night. On the ground, the effect is more pronounced. The thermite bombs do their work, igniting the dry undergrowth. A fire begins to spread. A U.S. Forest Service lookout, Howard Raz Gardner, at his tower on Mount Emily, spots the unfamiliar aircraft and, shortly after the rising plume of smoke, he alerts his supervisor. The news travels up the chain of command, met initially with disbelief, but the evidence is irrefutable. The military machinery, humiliated and enraged, jolts into action. Within hours, aircraft from the 42nd Bombardment Group and the 55th Fighter Squadron are scrambled from McCord Field and other bases, scouring the coastal range for the intruder. On the coast, the USS Phelps and other vessels receive new, urgent orders: find and destroy the enemy submarine known to be in the area. The hunt for the ghost has become a furious, all-out pursuit. The bombs had fallen, the message had been delivered, but for Fujita and Okuda, the most perilous leg of the journey was just beginning, the long, exposed flight back to a waiting submarine that was itself now a hunted thing. The return flight was a race against time and a test of nerve. Nobuo Fujita pushed the Tiny Glen to its limits, staying low, using the terrain as cover, his eyes constantly scanning the empty skies around him. The initial euphoria of a successful bomb run had evaporated, replaced by a cold, gnawing anxiety. Every minute in the air increased the chance of being spotted by a civilian, a patrol boat, or the fighter planes he knew would be scrambling. The coastline, once a distant goal, now appeared on the horizon, a thin, gray line separating the relative safety of the ocean from the deadly scrutiny of the land. Then the first sign of trouble, a faint sputter from the engine, a drop in RPMs. Fujita's trained ear immediately detected the anomaly. The engine was running rough, losing power. The cause was likely contaminated fuel drawn from the submarine's tanks, or perhaps simply the strain of the mission. In that moment, the calculus of the entire operation changed. The carefully laid plan to return to the prearranged rendezvous point, land near the submerged I-25, be hoisted aboard and disappear, was now in grave jeopardy. The engine coughed again, more violently this time. The altimeter began a slow, unstoppable descent. They were losing height. The vast, cold expanse of the Pacific Ocean, which had been their highway, was now transforming into a potential grave. It was at this precise moment, this crisis point, that Fujita made a decision that would define his life. The samurai code demanded he fight until the end, even if that end was a watery crash. But the pilot's instinct for survival, the analytical assessment of the situation, took over. He saw a chance, a slim one. On the horizon, he identified the distinct silhouette of a warship, the USS Phelps, the very vessel hunting him. Seemingly insane thought crystallized into a plan. Ditching near the I-25 was now too risky. The failing engine might not get them there, and the submarine would be exposed. If it surfaced, a controlled crash landing in the open ocean meant almost certain death from exposure or drowning in the wreckage. But the destroyer, represented life. It had boats, it had crew. It was a hard, undeniable fact in a sea of uncertainties. To be captured was a fate worse than death, according to his indoctrination, but it was a fate that was alive. He made his choice. He would not die for a failed engine. He aimed the faltering aircraft not away from the American warship, but directly for it. He lined up his approach as if for a final, unarmed attack run. He cut the sputtering engine and went into a controlled glide. The silence was deafening, broken only by the whistle of wind through the struts. The sea rushed up to meet them. He flared the aircraft at the last possible second, settling it as gently as possible onto the swells. The impact was still brutal, jarring. The fragile floatplane shuddered, but it remained intact, buoyed by its pontoons. They were down, they were alive, and they were now prisoners, adrift in the shadow of the enemy. They had come to bomb. The deliberate crash was not an act of surrender, but a calculated decision for survival. An event that would bind the fates of the Japanese pilot and the American destroyer in an unexpected and profound way. The immediate aftermath was a flurry of action and a study in starkly different realities. For the crew of the USS Phelps, the sight of a Japanese floatplane deliberately crash landing nearby was a moment of profound shock and confusion. This was not a dying aircraft being shot down. It was a controlled, intentional act. The general quarters alarm clanged across the ship. Sailors rushed to their battle stations, training weapons on the fragile bobbing aircraft, expecting some form of trickery or a final, suicidal act of resistance. A whaleboat was lowered into the water, its crew armed and wary as they approached the wreck. What they found were two men, not fanatical warriors, but exhausted and soaking wet aviators, clinging to their sinking plane. Nobuo Fujita, in a final act of defiance against his captors, or perhaps in adherence to his code, attempted to destroy the Glen by slashing its canvas wings with his tanto, his short sword. He was quickly subdued by American sailors. He and Okuda were hauled into the boat. Prisoners of war, the Glen, a priceless intelligence asset, was salvaged and taken. Aboard the Phelps, the hunters had captured the Ghost. For the I-25, the wait was agonizing. Commander Tagami and his crew listened for the sound of the returning engine. It never came. They monitored American radio traffic, which began to buzz with activity. They knew something had gone terribly wrong. To surface and search was to invite destruction. With a heavy heart, Tagami was forced to make the only decision he could. He submerged the I-25 and slipped away into the deep, leaving his aviators to their fate. The submarine would continue its war for several more months, but its unique offensive capability was now extinguished. It was sunk off the New Hebrides in September 1943, taking most of its crew, including Commander Tagami, to the bottom. On the American mainland, the fire started by Fujita's bombs was quickly contained by quick-acting fire patrol. It burned less than an acre. Physically, the attack was a failure. But psychologically, it was a stunning success. Newspapers across the country blared the headlines: Jap plane bombs Oregon forest. The public reaction was a mixture of outrage, fear, and a strange, grim pride that the war had finally, tangibly, reached their doorstep. The military, deeply embarrassed, was forced to significantly enhance West Coast air defenses, diverting resources and attention from other theaters. Fujita had achieved his strategic objective, not with fire but with fear. For Fujita and Okuda, their war was over. They were interrogated, first aboard the Phelps and then at a stateside POW camp. They adhered to the Japanese military code, giving only their name, rank, and service number. Fujita, expecting torture and execution, was instead treated with a professionalism and a humanity that deeply conflicted with everything he had been taught to expect. This was the first crack in the facade of the enemy he had been conditioned to hate. He would spend the rest of the war in captivity, a living secret, his legendary mission known only to a few, while the world outside moved on to larger, more destructive battles. The war would end, but the story of the pilot who bombed Oregon was far from over. Destined to evolve in a way no one on that tense September morning could have possibly foreseen. The end of the war in 1945 did not bring an end to Nobuo Fujita's internal conflict. Repatriated to a devastated Japan, he returned to his hometown of Kanasu, Saitama Prefecture. He opened a hardware store, building a quiet life amid the ruins of the empire he had served, but the memory of Oregon and the weight of his actions never left him. He lived with a private shame, a fear that he was a war criminal who had attacked civilians and that the people of Brookings, Oregon, must harbor a deep and lasting hatred for him. For nearly 2 decades, this guilt festered in silence. Then in 1962, an extraordinary invitation arrived, the Brookings Junior Chamber of Commerce, seeking to promote cultural understanding and perhaps put their town's unique history to rest, invited the former enemy pilot to visit as a guest of honor. The decision was controversial on both sides of the Pacific. Some in Brookings saw it as an insult to American veterans. Some in Japan saw it as a shameful act for a former warrior. But Fujita, after much soul-searching, accepted. He saw it as a chance to atone. His arrival in Brookings that May was charged with a palpable tension. The national media was there, watching to see if this gesture of reconciliation would succeed or explode in controversy. What they witnessed was something profoundly human. Fujita, small, formal man, was visibly nervous, but instead of meeting hostility, he was met with a cautious and then growing warmth. He presented the city with a powerful symbol of peace, his family's 400-year-old katana, the same type of sword he had carried on his wartime missions. He stated it was to be a gesture of apology and of his hope that it would remain in the town forever. In a stunning reversal of his 1942 mission, he then planted a tree at the bomb site as a symbol of regrowth and peace. The samurai warrior had become an ambassador. This single act transformed him. The visit was not an end, but a beginning. Nobuo Fujita returned to Brookings 3 more times over the years, each visit deepening the bonds of friendship. He donated books and funds to the local library to foster education about Japanese culture. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the war's end, the town made him an honorary citizen of Brookings. 2 years later, the man who had once been their enemy was gone, but his legacy was not. In accordance with his dying wish, a portion of his ashes were brought back to the forest near Mount Emily and scattered at the bomb site. The final, peaceful return of the pilot to the place that had haunted his dreams. Journey of reconciliation that was now complete. The story of the sword, the tree, and the scattered ashes closed a circle that began with fire and fear. ending instead with an enduring lesson in the possibility of peace. In the vast, brutal calculus of World War II, the bombing of Oregon was a minor footnote: a few acres of scorched earth, 2 small bombs, a failed attempt to start a fire. It was a tactical insignificance, dwarfed by the cataclysmic battles at Stalingrad, Midway, and Normandy. Yet the story of Nobuo Fujita endures precisely because it transcends tactics and enters the realm of human truth. It is a narrative not of empires clashing, but of an individual's journey through the rigid constructs of duty, into the chaos of survival, and ultimately toward the hard-won ground of redemption. The image of the fragile Glenn biplane, launched from a submarine in the darkness, represents the extreme lengths to which nations will go to wage war, crafting ingenious weapons to deliver terror. But the image of the same pilot, decades later, planting a tree where he once sought to sow fire, represents a far more profound and enduring human capacity, the capacity for reconciliation. Fujita's life arc challenges the very notion of a fixed identity, from warrior to prisoner, from enemy to friend, from a symbol aggression to an instrument of peace. His story demonstrates that the end of a war does not have to mean the perpetuation of hatred, that the same hands that once released bombs can later tenderly place a sapling in the soil. The 400-year-old sword, once carried for battle, now rests in a library in Brookings, Oregon. It is no longer a weapon, but a relic of a transformed understanding. It speaks to the idea that honor is not found only in how one is willing to die for a cause, but also in how one chooses to live with the consequences, and in the courage it takes to seek forgiveness. The forests of the Siskiyou National Forest have long since healed over the small scar Fujita left. In their quiet, enduring growth, they offer a final, silent lesson that history's deepest wounds can, with time and a conscious will for peace, be healed, not forgotten but overcome. The echo of a single engine over Oregon is no longer a sound of threat, but a reminder of our shared, flawed humanity and the enduring hope for a future built not on the wreckage of the past, but from the seeds of understanding planted upon it.